The autumn wind howled through the Denver suburbs as Elena Ramirez pressed her 3-year-old daughter Sophia closer to her chest, both of them huddled in the cramped bathroom of their modest ranch home on Maple Street. Outside the locked door, Carlos's voice thundered with alcohol-fueled rage, his fists pounding against the walls with terrifying intensity. Elena's left eye was already swelling shut from his earlier assault, and her ribs ached with each shallow breath. This wasn't the first time Carlos had lost control, but tonight felt different, darker, more dangerous than ever before. "Mommy scared?" Sophia whispered, her tiny fingers clutching Elena's torn blouse. The little girl's wide brown eyes reflected a wisdom far beyond her years, having witnessed too much violence in her short life. Elena forced a brave smile, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Everything's going to be okay, Mia," she lied softly, knowing that Carlos's rage was escalating beyond anything she'd experienced in their 5 turbulent years of marriage. The smell of whiskey and cocaine hung heavy in the air, seeping under the bathroom door like toxic fog. Carlos had been using drugs more frequently lately, and when he mixed them with alcohol, he became a monster capable of anything. The crash of breaking dishes echoed from the kitchen, followed by Carlos screaming obscenities that made Elena cover Sophia's ears. He was destroying everything in his path, looking for them with the single-minded determination of a predator hunting prey. Elena had managed to dial 911 before barricading herself in the bathroom, but the minutes felt like hours as she waited for help to arrive. At 11:47 p.m. precisely, the wail of sirens pierced the night air like a symphony of salvation. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as red and blue lights flickered through the small bathroom window. The sound of heavy boots on the front porch was followed by authoritative voices demanding entry. Carlos's rampage suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than his screaming. Detective Maria Santos arrived first, her German Shepherd partner Rex trotting obediently beside her as she approached the chaos. Inside 412 Maple Street. At 35, Santos was a seasoned domestic violence investigator with 8 years on the force and a reputation for treating victims with genuine compassion. Rex, a 4-year-old purebred with intelligent amber eyes, was trained in narcotics detection, but also served as a calming presence for traumatized families. Denver police. Carlos Ramirez, step away from the door with your hands visible, Santos commanded, her voice cutting through the suburban night like a blade. She could hear muffled sobs coming from somewhere inside the house, confirming that victims were present and potentially in immediate danger. Carlos stumbled to the front door, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, reeking of alcohol and barely able to stand upright. His knuckles were split and bleeding from punching walls, and his t-shirt was torn and stained with what looked like Elena's blood. "She's crazy, officer," he slurred, swaying dangerously. "My wife's lost her mind. I was just trying to calm her down." Santos had heard similar lies countless times before. She expertly cuffed Carlos while reading him his rights, her trained eyes scanning the destruction visible throughout the living room. Overturned furniture, broken picture frames, and holes punched in drywall painted a clear picture of domestic terrorism. Rex sat calmly nearby, his presence providing a sense of security and order amidst the chaos. Just as Santos was securing Carlos in her patrol car, Officer Brad Morrison arrived on scene with his Belgian Malinois Duke. Morrison was a 15-year veteran with a reputation for aggressive policing and questionable judgment. Duke was larger and more intimidating than Rex, a muscular, dark-coated animal with pale eyes that seemed to assess threats with predatory calculation. "Need backup in there?" Morrison called out, though Santos hadn't requested additional units. Something about his eager demeanor set her instincts on edge, but she was focused on locating the victims and ensuring their safety. Elena finally emerged from the bathroom when she heard Santos calling her name. Sophia clinging to her like a frightened koala. Both mother and daughter were visibly traumatized. Alana's face was bruised and swollen, her clothes torn, and Sophia's pajamas were stained with her mother's blood. The little girl's eyes darted nervously around the destroyed living room, taking in details that would later prove crucial. Santos knelt down to Elena's level, speaking in gentle, reassuring tones as she documented the injuries and gathered initial statements. Rex remained perfectly still near the kitchen, his calm demeanor helping to ease the tension in the room. Elena began recounting the evening's events through tears and broken sentences, describing months of escalating abuse that had culminated in tonight's terrifying assault. That's when Morrison made his unauthorized entry into the house, bringing Duke inside without Santos's knowledge or permission. The massive Belgian Malinois immediately dominated the space with his imposing presence, his intense gaze fixed on Elena and Sophia with unmistakable menace. Unlike Rex's gentle demeanor, Duke radiated barely controlled aggression that made both victims shrink back in fear. "Ma'am, you need to understand something," Morrison said quietly, positioning himself between Elena and the front door while Duke moved closer to the cowering pair. His voice dropped to a threatening whisper that Sophia's young ears couldn't fully understand, but her instincts recognized as dangerous. "Your husband has been cooperative with our department on certain matters. It would be ... unfortunate ... if this incident became more complicated than necessary." Santos was outside processing Carlos and filling out paperwork, unaware that Morrison was intimidating her witnesses. Duke's low growl filled the silence as Morrison continued his threats, making it clear that Alana's cooperation with police would have consequences. The dog's teeth gleamed in the harsh overhead light as he moved closer to Sophia, who pressed herself against her mother's legs in terror. "Bad dog," Sophia whispered so quietly that only Elena heard, her small voice trembling with fear as she stared at Duke's threatening posture. The words would echo in her memory for months to come, though at that moment, no one realized this frightened child was witnessing evidence of corruption that would eventually bring down an entire criminal conspiracy. Morrison's intimidation lasted only minutes, but the message was clear. Elena needed to keep quiet about tonight's events, or there would be serious consequences for both her and her daughter. As Santos completed her external paperwork and prepared to enter the house for witness statements, Morrison quickly moved Duke outside and positioned himself as though he had just arrived for routine backup support. The rest of the evening proceeded according to standard protocol, with Santos taking Elena's official statement, while Morrison's presence was carefully omitted from all written reports. Carlos was processed and taken to county jail, where he would spend the night before posting bail the following morning. Elena received medical attention for her injuries, and social services conducted a preliminary welfare check on Sophia. But the seeds of corruption had been planted that night, watered by Morrison's threats, and cultivated by a system that allowed dirty cops to operate with impunity. As Elena tucked Sophia into bed in the early morning hours, neither of them could imagine that this terrifying night would eventually lead to justice. All because a brave little girl would remember a bad dog and speak 2 words that would change everything. 8 months had passed since that terrifying night on Maple Street, but for Elena Ramirez, the nightmare was far from over. She sat in the sterile hallway of the Jefferson County Family Court, her hands trembling as she watched her 3-year-old daughter Sophia color quietly in a Disney princess coloring book. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were fighting for their own fairy tale ending. But the villain in their story wore expensive suits and had learned to disguise his monstrous face behind a mask of reformed respectability. Carlos had been released on bail the morning after his arrest, and within weeks, he had assembled a legal team that Elena's public defender could never hope to match. His lawyer, Harrison Webb, was a silver-haired veteran of family court, with a reputation for turning abusive fathers into sympathetic figures deserving of second chances. Webb's retainer alone cost more than Elena made in 6 months working double shifts at the medical supply warehouse. "Remember, Elena," whispered Jennifer Walsh, Elena's overworked public defender, as she shuffled through a stack of case files that threatened to topple from her worn briefcase. "Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't let them provoke you. Webb will try to paint you as an angry, vindictive woman who's weaponizing Sophia against her father." Elena nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. At 28, she had never imagined her life would come to this, sitting in a courthouse, fighting to protect her daughter from the man she had once loved enough to marry. The months since Carlos's arrest had been a whirlwind of restraining orders, court-mandated anger management classes, supervised visitations, and legal paperwork that seemed designed to drain her both financially and emotionally. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom with the authority of someone who had seen every permutation of family dysfunction over her 20-year career on the bench. At 55, she was known for her no-nonsense approach and genuine concern for children's welfare, but she was also a stickler for rehabilitation and second chances. Elena feared that Carlos's rehabilitation theater might actually work on someone who wanted to believe in redemption stories. "Your Honor," Harrison Webb began with practiced eloquence as he stood before the bench in his perfectly tailored navy suit. "My client stands before you today as a transformed man. 8 months ago, Carlos Ramirez made a terrible mistake fueled by alcohol and personal struggles that he takes full responsibility for. But rather than making excuses, he has done the hard work of genuine change." Webb gestured toward a thick folder filled with certificates and testimonials. "Mr. Ramirez has completed a 90-day inpatient alcohol treatment program at the prestigious Mountain View Recovery Center, followed by 6 months of intensive outpatient therapy. He has attended every single anger management session, completed 40 hours of community service, and maintained steady employment at Denver Construction Solutions, where his supervisor describes him as their most reliable worker." Elena watched Carlos sit straighter as Webb painted this picture of transformation. Her ex-husband had indeed lost weight, traded his scruffy beard for a clean shave, and wore clothes that made him look like a responsible suburban father rather than the violent drunk who had terrorized her for years. The performance was so convincing that Elena almost doubted her own memories of that horrific night. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Webb continued, his voice taking on an indignant tone, "Ms. Ramirez has systematically alienated my client from his daughter during these 8 months of separation. Despite court-ordered supervised visitations, she has poisoned the child's mind against her father, creating an atmosphere of hostility that serves no one's interests, particularly not little Sophia's." Elena's face flushed with anger at the accusation, but Jennifer Walsh placed a restraining hand on her arm. This was exactly the reaction Webb wanted to provoke Elena into appearing unstable and vindictive in front of the judge. The character. Witnesses began their parade of testimony, each one carefully selected to support Carlos's redemption narrative. His AA sponsor, a soft-spoken man named Robert Chun, testified about Carlos's commitment to sobriety and his genuine remorse for past actions. His supervisor at the construction company, Maria Rodriguez, praised his work ethic and reliability. Even his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, described him as a helpful young man who shoveled her driveway all winter without being asked. "He's not the same man who made those terrible mistakes," Mrs. Patterson testified with grandmotherly conviction. "People can change, Your Honor, and Carlos has worked harder than anyone I've ever seen to become the father his daughter deserves." Jennifer Walsh's cross-examination felt weak and desperate in comparison. She pointed out that 8 months of good behavior couldn't erase 5 years of documented abuse, but Webb objected that his client had never been convicted of domestic violence. The charges had been reduced to disorderly conduct as part of a plea agreement. Walsh tried to introduce evidence of previous incidents, but most of Elena's earlier calls to police had resulted in no arrests, because she had been too frightened to press charges. "Ms. Ramirez," Webb said when Elena took the stand, his voice dripping with false concern, "isn't it true that you've struggled with depression and anxiety since your separation from my client? Haven't you been taking prescription medications that affect your judgment and emotional stability?" Elena's heart raced as she tried to explain that her antidepressants were a direct result of the trauma Carlos had inflicted. But Webb twisted her words to suggest she was mentally unstable and possibly unfit to care for Sofia. He produced evidence that Elena had called in sick to work 17 times in the past 8 months, implying that she was unreliable and possibly abusing her medications. The worst moment came when Webb played the recordings from Carlos's supervised visitations with Sofia. The little girl could be heard laughing and playing with her father, seemingly happy and comfortable in his presence. Webb had coached Carlos well. He sounded patient, loving, and genuinely interested in his daughter's life. There was no trace of the monster Elena knew lurked beneath the surface. "Your Honor," Webb concluded his presentation with theatrical emotion, "my client has done everything the court has asked of him and more. He has confronted his demons, conquered his addictions, and rebuilt his life from the ground up. To deny him the opportunity to be a father to his daughter would be a tragedy that serves no one. Sofia deserves to have both parents in her life, and Carlos Ramirez has earned the right to joint custody through his extraordinary efforts at rehabilitation." Judge Williams seemed genuinely moved by the presentation. Elena could see the scales of justice tipping in Carlos's favor as the judge reviewed the impressive documentation of his supposed transformation. The certificates, testimonials, and supervised visitation reports painted a picture of a man who had genuinely changed his life. "Ms. Walsh," Judge Williams said, "your client will have an opportunity to present her case, but I must say that Mr. Ramirez has made a compelling argument for joint custody. The court's primary concern is always the best interests of the child, and children generally benefit from having both parents actively involved in their lives." Elena felt her world crashing down around her as she realized that Carlos's expensive legal strategy was working. His performance had been flawless, his documentation thorough, and his transformation narrative compelling enough to convince even a seasoned family court judge. In just a few hours, she might be forced to share custody of her daughter with the man who had nearly killed her that night 8 months ago. As Judge Williams called for a brief recess, Elena held Sofia closer, whispering silent prayers that somehow, some way, the truth would emerge before it was too late. She had no idea that her daughter was about to provide exactly the miracle she needed in the form of 2 simple words that would expose everything. The Jefferson County family courtroom felt suffocating as Judge Patricia Williams reconvened after the 15-minute recess. Elena clutched Sofia against her chest, feeling the weight of impending doom settle over her like a burial shroud. Carlos sat confidently at the defendant's table, his transformation from monster to reformed father apparently complete in the eyes of the law. His expensive attorney, Harrison Webb, shuffled through papers with the satisfied air of a man who knew victory was within his grasp. Elena's public defender, Jennifer Walsh, looked defeated as she whispered final instructions. "Elena, I'm going to do everything I can," but his presentation was strong. The judge seems convinced by his rehabilitation story. "We need something concrete, something that proves he hasn't really changed." The courtroom was fuller now after the recess. Several court officers had positioned themselves around the perimeter for security, including Officer Brad Morrison with his imposing Belgian Malinois. Duke Morrison stood near the main entrance, his uniform crisp and professional, Duke sitting obediently at his side. To any casual observer, they represented law, order, and protection. But Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold, the way Morrison's eyes kept darting toward her and Sophia, his expression unreadable, but somehow threatening. Judge Williams adjusted her reading glasses and addressed the court. We will now hear closing arguments before I render my decision on custody arrangements. Mr. Webb, you may proceed. Harrison Webb rose with theatrical grace, his silver hair catching the fluorescent lights as he began his final appeal. Your Honor, this case represents everything that is right about our justice system's capacity for redemption and second chances. Carlos Ramirez stands before you not as the broken man who made terrible mistakes 8 months ago, but as proof that people can change when they commit to doing the hard work of transformation. Elena felt Sophia shifting restlessly in her arms. The little girl had been unusually quiet during the proceedings, her big brown eyes taking in everything with the intense focus that 3-year-olds sometimes displayed when processing confusing adult situations. Elena assumed her daughter was simply tired from the long morning, but Sophia's body language suggested something else entirely. The evidence is overwhelming, Webb continued, gesturing toward the thick folder of certificates and testimonials. 90 days of inpatient treatment, 6 months of therapy, perfect attendance at anger management classes, steady employment, and glowing character references. My client has not just talked about change, he has demonstrated it through concrete actions over 8 months of sustained effort. As Webb spoke, Sophia began to squirm more noticeably in Elena's arms. The child's eyes had locked onto something across the courtroom with an intensity that made Elena follow her gaze. That's when she saw Duke, Morrison's canine partner, sitting stoically near the entrance. The massive dog's pale eyes seemed to be scanning the room with predatory calculation, and Elena felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. Furthermore, Webb continued, his voice growing more passionate, denying Mr. Ramirez joint custody would punish not only him, but also his innocent daughter, who deserves to have both parents in her life. The supervised visitations have shown that Sophia is comfortable and happy with her father. There is no evidence of ongoing danger or unfitness. Sophia's squirming became more pronounced, and Elena noticed that her daughter's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. The little girl's eyes remained fixed on Duke, and her tiny hands began to tremble. Elena recognized the signs of distress that Sophia had exhibited occasionally over the past 8 months, usually during nightmares or when loud noises startled her awake. Your Honor, Webb concluded with practiced emotion, I urge you to consider the best interests of the child and grant my client the joint custody he has earned through his extraordinary efforts at rehabilitation. Carlos Ramirez has paid his debt to society and deserves the chance to be the father his daughter needs. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully as Webb returned to his seat. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this was it, the moment that would determine whether she would be forced to hand her daughter over to her abuser for half of every week, every month, for years to come. Miss Walsh, Judge Williams said, your closing argument, please. Jennifer Walsh stood on unsteady legs, knowing she was fighting an uphill battle with insufficient ammunition. Your Honor, 8 months of good behavior cannot erase 5 years of documented abuse and terrorism. My client lives in constant fear. Bad dog. The words exploded from Sophia's small throat like a thunderclap in the formal silence of the courtroom. Every head in the room turned toward the 3-year-old as she pointed directly at Duke with unwavering accuracy. Her tiny finger trembled but remained steady, aimed like an arrow at Morrison's canine partner. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Williams's gavel froze halfway to the bench. Harrison Webb's mouth fell open in mid-sentence. Carlos went pale, his carefully constructed composure cracking for the first time all day. But it was Officer Morrison's reaction that spoke volumes. His face drained of color, and he immediately began moving Duke toward the exit. Bad dog, bad dog," Sophia repeated, her voice growing louder and more insistent. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as memories that had been buried for 8 months suddenly surfaced with crystal clarity. The massive Belgian Malinois that had growled at her and her mother that terrible night. The threatening man who had whispered scary words while the big dog showed its teeth. Elena felt as though she had been struck by lightning. Sophia had never exhibited this kind of specific, targeted fear toward any other dog they had encountered. Over the past 8 months, they had visited parks where children played with golden retrievers, walked past German shepherds on neighborhood streets, and even met Rex, Detective Santos's partner, during follow-up interviews. But this reaction was different, visceral, terrified, and absolutely certain. "Your Honor," Officer Morrison called out quickly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Children are often frightened by police dogs. This is a normal reaction." No," Sophia screamed, pointing more emphatically at Duke as Morrison tried to remove him from the courtroom. "Bad dog scared mommy. Bad man with bad dog." The little girl's words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Morrison's attempt to downplay the situation had backfired spectacularly, drawing more attention to Duke rather than less. Judge Williams leaned forward, her experienced instincts recognizing that something significant was unfolding before her eyes. Jennifer Walsh felt her prosecutor instincts kick into overdrive. Years of criminal law had taught her to recognize when unexpected evidence presented itself, and Sophia's reaction was too specific, too intense, and too targeted to be coincidental. The child was identifying something or someone that had traumatized her. "Your Honor," Walsh said quickly, "I request an immediate recess to investigate this matter further. My client's daughter appears to be identifying someone or something that was present during the incident 8 months ago, but not properly documented in the police reports." Carlos's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is clearly an attempt to manufacture evidence. A 3-year-old's fear of a police dog cannot possibly be considered relevant testimony." But Judge Williams was studying Sophia's reaction with the keen eye of someone who had spent 2 decades observing human behavior in high-stress situations. The child's terror was authentic, specific, and directed at something that clearly triggered powerful memories. More importantly, Officer Morrison's nervous attempts to remove Duke from the courtroom suggested that he had something to hide. "Bad dog scared mommy," Sophia repeated through her tears, her small voice echoing off the courtroom walls like an accusation that could not be ignored. "Bad man said mean things." Elena felt hope flicker in her chest for the first time in months. Her daughter's innocent words had just torn a hole in the carefully constructed lies that surrounded that terrible night 8 months ago. Whatever Sophia had witnessed, whatever had been hidden or covered up, was about to come to light. Judge Williams looked from the terrified child to the nervous police officer to the suddenly pale defendant. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, "were you present at the domestic violence incident involving the Ramirez family 8 months ago?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Morrison's head, and everyone in the courtroom knew that his answer would change everything. The Jefferson County family courtroom felt suffocating as Judge Patricia Williams reconvened after the 15-minute recess. Elena clutched Sophia against her chest, feeling the weight of impending doom settle over her like a burial shroud. Carlos sat confidently at the defendant's table, his transformation from monster to reformed father apparently complete in the eyes of the law. His expensive attorney, Harrison Webb, shuffled through papers with the satisfied air of a man who knew victory was within his grasp. Alana's public defender, Jennifer Walsh, looked defeated as she whispered final instructions. "Elena, I'm going to do everything I can," but his presentation was strong. The judge seemed convinced by his rehabilitation story. "We need something concrete, something that proves he hasn't really changed. The courtroom was fuller now after the recess. Several court officers had positioned themselves around the perimeter for security, including Officer Brad Morrison with his imposing Belgian Malinois. Duke Morrison stood near the main entrance, his uniform crisp and professional, Duke sitting obediently at his side. To any casual observer, they represented law, order, and protection. But Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold, the way Morrison's eyes kept darting toward her and Sophia, his expression unreadable, but somehow threatening. Judge Williams adjusted her reading glasses and addressed the court. We will now hear closing arguments before I render my decision on custody arrangements. Mr. Webb, you may proceed. Harrison Webb rose with theatrical grace, his silver hair catching the fluorescent lights as he began his final appeal. Your Honor, this case represents everything that is right about our justice system's capacity for redemption and second chances. Carlos Ramirez stands before you not as the broken man who made terrible mistakes 8 months ago, but as proof that people can change when they commit to doing the hard work of transformation. Elena felt Sophia shifting restlessly in her arms. The little girl had been unusually quiet during the proceedings, her big brown eyes taking in everything with the intense focus that 3-year-olds sometimes displayed when processing confusing adult situations. Elena assumed her daughter was simply tired from the long morning, but Sophia's body language suggested something else entirely. The evidence is overwhelming, Webb continued, gesturing toward the thick folder of certificates and testimonials. 90 days of inpatient treatment, 6 months of therapy, perfect attendance at anger management classes, steady employment, and glowing character references. My client has not just talked about change, he has demonstrated it through concrete actions over 8 months of sustained effort. As Webb spoke, Sophia began to squirm more noticeably in Elena's arms. The child's eyes had locked onto something across the courtroom with an intensity that made Elena follow her gaze. That's when she saw Duke, Morrison's canine partner, sitting stoically near the entrance. The massive dog's pale eyes seemed to be scanning the room with predatory calculation, and Elena felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. Furthermore, Webb continued, his voice growing more passionate, denying Mr. Ramirez joint custody would punish not only him, but also his innocent daughter, who deserves to have both parents in her life. The supervised visitations have shown that Sophia is comfortable and happy with her father. There is no evidence of ongoing danger or unfitness. Sophia's squirming became more pronounced, and Elena noticed that her daughter's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. The little girl's eyes remained fixed on Duke, and her tiny hands began to tremble. Elena recognized the signs of distress that Sophia had exhibited occasionally over the past 8 months, usually during nightmares, or when loud noises startled her awake. Your Honor, Webb concluded with practiced emotion, I urge you to consider the best interests of the child and grant my client the joint custody he has earned through his extraordinary efforts at rehabilitation. Carlos Ramirez has paid his debt to society and deserves the chance to be the father his daughter needs. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully as Webb returned to his seat. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this was it, the moment that would determine whether she would be forced to hand her daughter over to her abuser for half of every week, every month, for years to come. Ms. Walsh, Judge Williams said, your closing argument, please. Jennifer Walsh stood on unsteady legs, knowing she was fighting an uphill battle with insufficient ammunition. Your Honor, 8 months of good behavior cannot erase 5 years of documented abuse and terrorism. My client lives in constant fear. Bad dog. The words exploded from Sophia's small throat like a thunderclap in the formal silence of the courtroom. Every head in the room turned toward the 3-year-old, as she pointed directly at Duke with unwavering accuracy. Her tiny finger trembled but remained steady, aimed like an arrow at Morrison's canine partner. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Williams's gavel froze halfway to the bench. Harrison Webb's mouth fell open in mid-sentence. Carlos went pale, his carefully constructed composure cracking for the first time all day. But it was Officer Morrison's reaction that spoke volumes. His face drained of color, and he immediately began moving Duke toward the exit. "Bad dog! Bad dog!" Sophia repeated, her voice growing louder and more insistent. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as memories that had been buried for 8 months suddenly surfaced with crystal clarity. The massive Belgian Malinois that had growled at her and her mother that terrible night. The threatening man who had whispered scary words while the big dog showed its teeth. Elena felt as though she had been struck by lightning. Sophia had never exhibited this kind of specific, targeted fear toward any other dog they had encountered. Over the past 8 months, they had visited parks where children played with golden retrievers, walked past German shepherds on neighborhood streets, and even met Rex, Detective Santos's partner, during follow-up interviews. But this reaction was different, visceral, terrified, and absolutely certain. "Your Honor," Officer Morrison called out quickly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Children are often frightened by police dogs. This is a normal reaction." No," Sophia screamed, pointing more emphatically at Duke as Morrison tried to remove him from the courtroom. "Bad dog scared mommy. Bad man with bad dog." The little girl's words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Morrison's attempt to downplay the situation had backfired spectacularly, drawing more attention to Duke rather than less. Judge Williams leaned forward, her experienced instincts recognizing that something significant was unfolding before her eyes. Jennifer Walsh felt her prosecutor instincts kick into overdrive. Years of criminal law had taught her to recognize when unexpected evidence presented itself, and Sophia's reaction was too specific, too intense, and too targeted to be coincidental. The child was identifying something, or someone that had traumatized her. "Your Honor," Walsh said quickly, "I request an immediate recess to investigate this matter further. My client's daughter appears to be identifying someone or something that was present during the incident 8 months ago, but not properly documented in the police reports." Carlos's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is clearly an attempt to manufacture evidence. A 3-year-old's fear of a police dog cannot possibly be considered relevant testimony." But Judge Williams was studying Sophia's reaction with the keen eye of someone who had spent 2 decades observing human behavior in high-stress situations. The child's terror was authentic, specific, and directed at something that clearly triggered powerful memories. More importantly, Officer Morrison's nervous attempts to remove Duke from the courtroom suggested that he had something to hide. "Bad dog scared mommy," Sophia repeated through her tears, her small voice echoing off the courtroom walls like an accusation that could not be ignored. "Bad man said mean things." Elena felt hope flicker in her chest for the first time in months. Her daughter's innocent words had just torn a hole in the carefully constructed lies that surrounded that terrible night 8 months ago. Whatever Sophia had witnessed, whatever had been hidden or covered up, was about to come to light. Judge Williams looked from the terrified child to the nervous police officer to the suddenly pale defendant. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, "were you present at the domestic violence incident involving the Ramirez family 8 months ago?" A question hung in the air like a sword over Morrison's head, and everyone in the courtroom knew that his answer would change everything. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Denver felt like something from a crime thriller as Jennifer Walsh pulled her battered Honda Civic between rusted shipping containers at exactly midnight. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she checked her rearview mirror for the 3rd time. paranoid that Morrison's people might have followed her to this clandestine meeting. 3 days had passed since the anonymous threat, and Elena was now living in a safe house with Sophia, while Walsh worked desperately to build a case strong enough to bring down the entire conspiracy. Captain Lisa Torres emerged from the shadows. Like a ghost, her 20-year career in law enforcement evident in her cautious, measured movements. At 45, she had survived in a male-dominated department by being smarter, tougher, and more ethical than her colleagues. But Morrison's corruption had finally pushed her to the breaking point, where she was willing to risk everything to expose the truth. "You have no idea how deep this goes," Torres whispered, as they walked between towering stacks of abandoned cargo containers. "Morrison isn't just some rogue cop taking bribes. He's been running the most sophisticated criminal protection racket I've ever seen, and it reaches all the way to the mayor's office." Walsh felt her stomach drop as Torres handed her a thick manila envelope filled with documents that represented months of secret investigation. Bank records, wiretap transcripts, surveillance photos, and internal memos painted a picture of corruption, so extensive that it seemed impossible for one person to have orchestrated it all. Morrison's been collecting protection money from over 30 domestic abusers, drug dealers, and petty criminals throughout the metro area, Torres explained, her voice barely audible over the distant highway traffic. $500 to $2,000 per month, depending on the severity of their crimes and the level of protection they need. Carlos Ramirez was paying $1,500 monthly to assure Elena never pressed serious charges. The financial records were staggering. Morrison had accumulated over $400,000 in offshore accounts over the past 3 years, money that was being laundered through a series of shell companies and real estate investments. But the corruption went far beyond simple bribery. Morrison was actively manipulating the justice system to protect his clients from consequences. "Look at this," Torres said, pointing to a surveillance photo of Morrison meeting with Assistant District Attorney Kevin Bradshaw outside an upscale restaurant. Bradshaw has been reducing charges and dropping cases in exchange for campaign contributions from Morrison's network. The ADA's re-election campaign received over $75,000 in donations from companies that don't actually exist. They're all fronts for Morrison's operation. Walsh studied the documents with growing horror, realizing that Elena and Sophia had been trapped in a system designed to protect their abuser at every level. Police reports were altered, evidence was suppressed, witnesses were intimidated, and prosecutors were bought off, creating a perfect storm of institutional failure that allowed violent men like Carlos to operate with impunity. The most damning evidence came in the form of audio recordings that Torres had been secretly making for months. Morrison's voice crackled through a small digital device as he discussed business with his network of protected criminals. "The beauty of this system is that everyone wins. You pay me, I protect you from serious charges. The department gets good arrest statistics, and the politicians get to claim they're tough on crime. The only people who lose are the victims, and who gives a shit about them?" Torres's investigation had also uncovered Morrison's methods for recruiting and controlling his network of informants. He would target domestic violence cases specifically, offering protection to abusers in exchange for information about drug activity in their neighborhoods. The abusers would then be encouraged to escalate their violence, knowing that Morrison would ensure they faced minimal consequences, while their terrified victims provided a steady stream of intelligence about criminal activity in their communities. "He's been using Duke as his personal weapon of intimidation," Torres continued, showing Walsh veterinary records that revealed the dog had been trained not for standard police work, but specifically for psychological warfare. "The department thinks Duke is trained for narcotics detection, but Morrison paid a private trainer to teach the dog aggressive intimidation techniques. That's why Sophia was so terrified. Duke was trained to terrorize witnesses into silence. The conspiracy extended to Judge Patricia Williams's own courtroom, where Morrison had been feeding information to Carlos's expensive attorney, Harrison. Webb's seemingly miraculous ability to present compelling evidence of Carlos's rehabilitation was actually the result of inside information about the court's preferences and prejudices, provided by Morrison in exchange for additional payments. Webb knew exactly what buttons to push with Judge Williams because Morrison had been studying her cases for months, Torres revealed. They knew she had a soft spot for rehabilitation stories, so they crafted Carlos's entire transformation narrative, specifically to appeal to her judicial philosophy. But the most shocking revelation came when Torres showed Walsh a series of text messages between Morrison and Deputy Chief Robert Hayes that proved the corruption reached the highest levels of law enforcement leadership. Hayes hadn't just been turning a blind eye to Morrison's activities. He had been actively facilitating them in exchange for statistical improvements that boosted his own career prospects. Hayes has been blocking my internal affairs investigations from the beginning, Torres explained. Every time I tried to examine Morrison's cases, Hayes would redirect me to other priorities or claim that ongoing operations would be compromised. He's been protecting Morrison because the drug arrests from Morrison's informant network made Hayes look like a hero in the fight against narcotics trafficking. The text messages revealed Hayes planning to use Morrison's success statistics in his campaign for police chief, promising to expand the informant protection program throughout Colorado if he received the promotion. The deputy chief had been so focused on advancing his career that he was willing to sacrifice domestic violence victims to maintain his arrest numbers. Walsh realized they now had evidence of a conspiracy that included police officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and department leadership, a criminal enterprise, masquerading as law enforcement that had been operating for years without detection. But Torres delivered the most terrifying news last. Morrison knows we're investigating, she whispered, looking around nervously. He's planning to eliminate Elena and Sophia permanently before they can testify. I intercepted communications suggesting they're going to stage it as a murder-suicide, making it look like Elena killed her daughter and then herself out of despair over losing the custody battle. Torres handed Walsh a burner phone and a key to a storage unit across town. Everything you need to take down the entire network is in that storage unit: documents, recordings, financial records, witness statements from other victims who were too scared to come forward until now. But you have maybe 48 hours before Morrison makes his move. As Walsh drove away from the warehouse, her mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. Elena and Sophia weren't just fighting for custody, they were fighting for their lives against a criminal conspiracy that had been protecting violent men and terrorizing women for years. The innocent words of a 3-year-old had exposed a system of corruption so vast that bringing it down would require perfect timing, unshakable evidence, and a massive leap of faith in the justice system's ability to police itself. Walsh knew that the next 48 hours would determine whether Elena and Sophia would live to see justice served or become the final victims of Morrison's reign of terror. The safe house on Colfax Avenue looked like any other rundown apartment building in Denver's urban sprawl, but Elena Ramirez knew that the peeling paint and broken security cameras concealed layers of protection that stood between her daughter and certain death. For 6 days, she and 4-year-old Sophia had been living in this cramped 2-bedroom unit under the watchful eyes of U.S. Marshals, while Jennifer Walsh worked frantically to build an airtight case against Morrison's criminal empire before time ran out. Elena pressed her face against the reinforced window, watching unmarked surveillance vehicles patrol the street below. The Marshals had explained that Morrison's reach extended throughout local law enforcement, making federal protection the only viable option for keeping her family alive. But even with armed guards and secure communications, Elena felt the walls closing in as Morrison's desperation transformed into lethal determination. "Mommy, why can't we go home?" Sophia asked for the 100th time, her innocent eyes reflecting confusion about why their lives had become a prison of protection. The little girl didn't understand that her simple words in the courtroom had signed their death warrant, or that the bad dog she had identified represented a criminal conspiracy, willing to kill children to protect their secrets. The first direct attack came at 3:17 a.m. on Tuesday morning, when motion sensors detected someone attempting to disable the building's electrical system. Marshal Rebecca Chun, a 15-year veteran of witness protection, immediately activated emergency protocols, while her partner Marcus Rodriguez coordinated with federal backup units positioned throughout the neighborhood. "They're probing our defenses," Chun explained to Elena as they huddled in the interior hallway, the safest location in the apartment. "Morrison's people are testing our response times and security measures, looking for weaknesses they can exploit." Elena held Sophia tightly, trying to process the surreal reality that her ex-husband's connections to corrupt police had escalated into a federal manhunt. The little girl remained remarkably calm, perhaps too young to fully grasp the danger, or maybe strengthened by her mother's fierce determination to protect her at any cost. 24 hours later, Morrison's psychological warfare intensified when Elena's cell phone began receiving calls from numbers that shouldn't have existed. Her own voice played back to her, distorted and manipulated through audio editing software. "I can't take it anymore. I'm going to kill my daughter and then myself. This is the only way to end the pain." "They're manufacturing evidence for the staged murder-suicide," Walsh explained during an encrypted video call from her own undisclosed location. Morrison's people had been recording Elena's conversations and court testimony, then using voice synthesis technology to create fake suicide recordings they can use to cover up the murders. The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. Elena received text messages appearing to come from Sophia's daycare center, reporting behavioral problems and recommending psychiatric evaluation. Fake medical bills arrived claiming that Elena owed thousands of dollars for mental health treatments she had never received. Her bank account was mysteriously frozen due to suspicious activity, leaving her unable to access funds for basic necessities. But Morrison's most terrifying escalation came when he began targeting other victims in his protection network, sending a clear message that anyone who cooperated with the investigation would face immediate retaliation. Maria Santos discovered her elderly mother's assisted living facility had received anonymous bomb threats, forcing evacuation and terrorizing the 90-year-old woman who had done nothing wrong except raise a daughter with integrity. Lisa Torres found her teenage son's social media accounts hacked, with threats and disturbing images posted under his name that could destroy his college applications and future prospects. The message was clear. Morrison could reach anyone, anywhere, anytime, and would punish entire families for their relatives' cooperation with law enforcement. "He's escalating because he knows we're close," Walsh told Elena during their encrypted communication. "Torres gave me access to Morrison's financial records, and we've traced money flows that prove the conspiracy extends to city councilmen, state legislators, and federal contractors. Morrison isn't just protecting local criminals anymore. He's been facilitating a systematic program of government corruption that involves millions of dollars in diverted public funds." The evidence Walsh had uncovered was staggering in its scope and implications. Morrison's protection racket had evolved into a sophisticated money laundering operation that cleaned drug proceeds, kickbacks from city construction contracts, and embezzled funds from various government agencies. The domestic violence protection scheme was just one component of a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated every level of Colorado's political and law enforcement establishment. Deputy Chief Robert Hayes had been using Morrison's network to eliminate political opponents and troublesome investigators, while Assistant District Attorney Kevin Bradshaw had been dropping cases against major drug distributors in exchange for massive campaign contributions. The conspiracy included judges, city commissioners, and federal agents who had been bought, blackmailed, or intimidated into compliance with Morrison's expanding criminal empire. But Morrison's desperation reached new heights when he realized that eliminating Elena and Sophia wouldn't be enough to contain the investigation. Walsh had distributed copies of Torres's evidence to journalists, federal prosecutors, and internal affairs divisions in multiple states, creating a cascade of investigations that Morrison couldn't stop through intimidation or murder. "He's planning something massive," Torres warned during a panicked phone call to Walsh at 2 a.m. on Friday morning. "I intercepted communications suggesting Morrison and Hayes are going to stage a terrorist attack on the federal courthouse. Then blame it on domestic extremists. They're planning to kill dozens of innocent people, including Elena and Sophia, and claim it was a radical anti-government bombing designed to disrupt the trial." The plan was diabolical in its sophistication. Morrison had been cultivating relationships with actual domestic terrorists, feeding them information and encouraging their anti-government rhetoric, while secretly recording their conversations and collecting evidence of their extremist beliefs. When the courthouse bombing occurred, Morrison would present himself as the hero who had been investigating these dangerous radicals, while the deaths of Elena and Sophia would be dismissed as collateral damage in a terrorist attack. Walsh realized that Morrison's desperation had transformed him from a corrupt cop into something far more dangerous, a domestic terrorist willing to commit mass murder to protect his criminal empire. The conspiracy was no longer just about protecting domestic violence perpetrators or taking bribes. It had become a war against the justice system itself, with innocent civilians as expendable casualties. As Elena tucked Sophia into bed in their fortified safe house, she whispered a prayer that her daughter's innocent courage would ultimately triumph over the forces of corruption and violence that threatened to destroy their lives. Outside, federal agents maintained their vigilant watch, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice would prevail or whether Morrison's final gambit would succeed in silencing the truth forever. The little girl who had pointed at a bad dog and spoken 2 words that shattered lies was now at the center of a battle for the soul of American justice itself. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had been transformed into a fortress of justice, with concrete barriers, metal detectors, and heavily armed FBI agents creating layers of security that seemed more appropriate for a war zone than a legal proceeding. 3 weeks had passed since Morrison's terrorist plot was uncovered and thwarted, resulting in the largest law enforcement corruption case in Colorado history. Now, Elena Ramirez sat in the witness protection section of Judge Margaret Harrison's courtroom, holding 4-year-old Sophia's hand as they prepared to face the monsters who had terrorized their lives. Morrison sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his once intimidating presence reduced to that of a cornered animal facing life in federal prison. Gone was the arrogant officer who had used Duke to terrorize domestic violence victims. In his place sat a broken man whose criminal empire had collapsed under the weight of evidence that his own actions had created. Deputy Chief Robert Hayes occupied the adjacent defendant's table, his 25-year law enforcement career ending in disgrace as federal prosecutors prepared to present overwhelming evidence of his role in facilitating Morrison's corruption network. Federal prosecutor Sarah Martinez had assembled a prosecution team that read like a directory of the Justice Department's most skilled attorneys. The evidence against Morrison and his co-conspirators filled 17 bankers' boxes and included over 400 hours of audio recordings, thousands of financial documents, and testimony from 47 witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Your Honor, Martinez began her opening statement with the calm authority of someone who had spent 20 years putting corrupt officials behind bars. The defendants in this case perverted the sacred trust that society places in law enforcement, transforming police badges into licenses for extortion, intimidation, and ultimately, attempted mass murder. Elena felt Sofia shift nervously in her lap as Martinez described how Morrison's protection racket had operated for years, collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars from criminals who paid for immunity from prosecution. The little girl didn't fully understand the legal proceedings, but she sensed the gravity of the moment and the importance of her role in bringing these bad people to justice. The prosecution's case unfolded like a master class in criminal investigation, with each witness providing another piece of the puzzle that revealed the full scope of Morrison's conspiracy. Detective Maria Santos took the stand first, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of testifying against her own department's leadership. Morrison approached me 2 days after the Ramirez domestic violence incident. Santos testified, her eyes never leaving the jury. He told me that Carlos Ramirez was providing valuable intelligence about drug activity in his neighborhood, and that it would be problematic if the domestic violence charges interfered with that arrangement. Santos played the secret recordings she had made of Morrison's instructions, his voice filling the courtroom with chilling clarity. Keep the report simple, minimize the woman's injuries, and forget that I was ever at that house. Carlos is too valuable to lose over some domestic bullshit. The jury's faces reflected shock and disgust as they listened to Morrison casually dismissing Elena's suffering as insignificant compared to his criminal profits. Several jurors wiped away tears when Santos described how Morrison had used Duke to terrorize Elena and Sofia into silence, turning a police dog into a weapon of intimidation. Captain Lisa Torres followed Santos to the witness stand, presenting the financial evidence that traced Morrison's corruption network through multiple states and federal agencies. Her months of secret investigation had uncovered bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, real estate investments purchased with drug money, and campaign contributions that were actually bribes disguised as political donations. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt cop, Torres explained to the jury. He was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that included judges, prosecutors, city officials, and federal contractors. The domestic violence protection scheme was just the beginning of a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of our justice system. But the most powerful testimony came when Elena took the stand, her voice trembling with emotion as she described the night that Morrison and Duke had shattered her family's sense of safety. She spoke directly to the jury about the months of fear and intimidation that followed, the constant terror that Carlos would return to finish what he started, and the courage it took to trust the justice system after learning how deeply it had been corrupted. I called 911 that night because I believed the police would protect us, Elena testified, tears streaming down her cheeks. Instead, Officer Morrison turned my call for help into another opportunity to terrorize my daughter and threaten our lives. He made it clear that Carlos's value as an informant was more important than our safety as human beings. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit Elena's testimony fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of Morrison's guilt. Their claims that she was an unreliable witness crumbled when prosecutors presented bank records showing Carlos's monthly payments to Morrison, surveillance footage of their meetings, and recordings of Morrison discussing his protection services with other criminal clients. Carlos himself had become the prosecution's most devastating witness after agreeing to testify against Morrison in exchange for a reduced sentence. His admission of paying Morrison $1,500 monthly for protection destroyed any remaining doubt about the conspiracy's existence. Morrison promised me that Elena would never be able to press serious charges, Carlos testified, his voice barely audible with shame. He said his dog would make sure she understood the consequences of causing trouble. I paid him because I was weak and selfish, but I never imagined it would escalate to attempted murder and terrorism. The trial's most emotional moment came when child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Chun presented Sophia's testimony through closed-circuit television, protecting the 4-year-old from the trauma of facing her tormentors directly while ensuring her voice was heard by the jury. "The bad dog scared Mommy," Sophia told the hushed courtroom, her innocent words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "The policeman with the bad dog said mean things and made Mommy cry. I don't like bad dogs or mean policemans." Her simple, honest testimony proved more devastating than hours of expert analysis. Here was a child who had witnessed corruption in its purest form, unfiltered by adult complexities or legal technicalities. Morrison's defense team had no way to cross-examine a 4-year-old's memories without appearing monstrous to the jury. The verdicts came after only 6 hours of deliberation. Morrison was found guilty on all 17 federal charges, including conspiracy, extortion, civil rights violations, and attempted terrorism. Deputy Chief Hayes received guilty verdicts on 14 charges related to his role in facilitating and protecting the corruption network. Assistant District Attorney Kevin Bradshaw, Defense Attorney Harrison Webb, and 9 other co-conspirators also faced federal convictions that would end their careers and freedom permanently. Judge Harrison's sentencing was swift and unforgiving. Morrison received life in federal prison without possibility of parole, while Hayes was sentenced to 25 years. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, ensuring that the entire criminal enterprise would be dismantled permanently. As Elena walked out of the courthouse with Sophia in her arms, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The little girl who had pointed at a bad dog and spoken 2 words that changed everything had helped deliver justice not just for their family, but for dozens of other victims who had suffered in silence under Morrison's reign of terror. Justice had finally prevailed, and it had come through the innocent courage of a child who refused to be silenced. 2 years had passed since that pivotal moment when 4-year-old Sophia Ramirez pointed at Duke and Judge Patricia Williams's courtroom and spoke the 2 words that would change countless lives forever. Now, on a brilliant September morning, Elena stood in the kitchen of their new home in the safe suburban neighborhood of Littleton, Colorado, watching her 6-year-old daughter chase butterflies in their carefully tended garden while wearing her first day of school backpack decorated with rainbow unicorns. The $4.2 million settlement from the city of Denver and the federal government had provided Elena with more than financial security. It had given her family the freedom to rebuild their lives without fear, to dream without limits, and to trust in a future where justice and safety weren't luxuries but fundamental rights. The modest 2-story colonial house with white picket fence might have seemed like a cliché, but for Elena and Sophia, it represented something precious beyond measure. A home where monsters couldn't find them. "Mommy, do you think Mrs. Patterson will like my drawing?" Sophia asked, holding up a colorful crayon portrait of her new first-grade teacher surrounded by smiling students. The little girl's artistic talents had flourished over the past 2 years, encouraged by art therapy sessions that had helped her process the trauma of those terrifying nights. While celebrating her courage in speaking truth to power, Elena knelt down to examine the drawing with appropriate maternal admiration, marveling at how completely Sophia had recovered from the horror they had endured together. The nightmares had stopped 18 months ago, replaced by dreams of becoming a veterinarian who helped scared animals feel safe again. It was a career choice that seemed perfectly suited to a child whose empathy and courage had already changed the world in ways she was still too young to understand. The transformation of the Denver Police Department had been as dramatic as Elena's personal recovery. The federal investigation triggered by Sophia's identification of Morrison's corruption had led to the resignation or termination of 37 officers, the restructuring of internal affairs procedures, and the implementation of new policies that made witness intimidation a career-ending offense with mandatory federal prosecution. Detective Maria Santos, promoted to lieutenant after her courage in exposing the conspiracy, now headed the department's new domestic violence task force, which had become a national model for protecting abuse victims and holding corrupt officers accountable. She visited Elena and Sophia regularly, not in an official capacity, but as a friend whose life had also been transformed by their shared experience with institutional corruption. Sophia's courage saved more than just your family, Santos had told Elena during their most recent visit. The reforms we've implemented have helped over 300 domestic violence victims get real protection and justice. Morrison's conviction opened the floodgates for other women to come forward, knowing they'll be believed and protected instead of intimidated into silence. The ripple effects of the case had extended far beyond Denver city limits. The federal investigation had exposed similar corruption networks in 12 other states, leading to indictments against 64 law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and government officials. The case had become required study material in police academies nationwide, used to teach new officers about the devastating consequences of corruption and the importance of protecting victims, regardless of political or economic pressures. Carlos Ramirez had served 18 months in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy before being released to a halfway house, where he participated in intensive domestic violence counseling and substance abuse treatment. His visitation rights had been permanently revoked after Elena successfully argued that his cooperation with Morrison's corruption network made him an ongoing danger to Sophia's emotional well-being. He had written letters of apology that Elena chose not to read, focusing instead on the healing process rather than relitigating past trauma. Morrison himself had become a cautionary tale whispered in law enforcement circles across the country. Serving life without parole in a DX Florence, a federal supermax prison in Colorado, he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, his criminal empire reduced to memories and regret. Duke, the Belgian Malinois, who had been trained to terrorize witnesses, had been retired from service and adopted by a ranch family in Montana, where he spent his days herding cattle instead of intimidating domestic violence victims. Elena's own transformation had been equally remarkable. She had completed her nursing degree with honors, specializing in trauma recovery and victim advocacy. Her thesis on the psychological impact of institutional corruption on abuse survivors had been published in the American Journal of Forensic Psychology, establishing her as a national expert on systemic revictimization. She now worked at the National Center for Victims of Crime in Washington, D.C., developing protocols to protect witnesses from corrupt law enforcement officials. The speaking engagements had begun tentatively, with Elena addressing small groups of domestic violence advocates and police reform activists. But as her confidence grew, so did the audiences. She had testified before congressional committees about the need for federal oversight of local police departments, spoken at the United Nations about corruption's impact on human rights, and delivered the keynote address at the International Conference on Police Accountability. "Your daughter's 2 words changed everything," she would often tell audiences, her voice strong with conviction, earned through survived trauma. But they only had power because we chose to listen, to investigate, and to act on what a child's innocent eyes had seen. Every one of us has the responsibility to hear truth when it's spoken, especially when it comes from the most vulnerable. Among us, Sophia, now thriving in first grade at Littleton Elementary, remained blissfully unaware of her role as a catalyst for national police reform. She knew that she had helped put bad people in jail and that her mommy was proud of her. Courage, but her 6-year-old world was appropriately filled with homework, playground friendships, and dreams of helping animals when she grew up. On quiet evenings, Elena would sometimes reflect on the journey that had brought them from that terrifying night on Maple Street to this peaceful suburban sanctuary. A drunk, violent husband. A corrupt police officer who turned protection into predation. A little girl who pointed at a bad dog and spoke two words that shattered a conspiracy of silence. But mostly, Elena focused on the future, on Sophia's laughter echoing through their safe home, on the victims whose lives had been saved by the reforms her daughter's courage had triggered, and on the knowledge that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power to change the world. As she tucked Sophia into bed that first night of school, Elena whispered the same words she had spoken every night for 2 years. You are brave, you are loved, and you made the world safer for everyone. And in her dreams, Sophia chased butterflies through fields of sunflowers, free from fear and full of hope for tomorrow.